Hey, thanks for tuning in again. I'm here with my dad for parts 2 and 3 this evening. For this session, we're going to talk a little bit about when you got out of the military. That's also quite an interesting story. In your words, you had to adjust to civilian life, and you, if I'm not mistaken, went all the way up the West Coast and into Canada and kind of came back unannounced. So let's talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, that's what I did, and here's how that came about. As I mentioned before, I was in Vietnam for 2 years, and I actually extended the second time to get a couple months out early, which put me out maybe 2 months ahead of time. But before I left Cherry Point, which is on the East Coast, this guy told me about the leave in Australia, but he also told me about you could order an MG and get it picked up tax-free at FOB San Francisco. And I was going to do that and drive home. But my parents said, there was this Conley from St. Thomas in Lee Sueur County that got discharged in New York, and he bought a new car. He never made it home. He had an accident. And in hindsight and looking back, my parents was probably the best decision they could have made because I was drinking a lot, and in an MG, I don't know if I would have made it home either. But when we left Vietnam, it was kind of sketchy because most of the Marines had to go through Da Nang. And right before I got there, Freedom Hill, whoever is supposed to go, was blown up. I mean, the barracks, everything was pretty much gone. So we're just hanging out on a little hill there, and I bumped into a fella from back home. Ed Marushka was a year ahead of me in school. He was in mortars. He was there and saw me. We never knew each other were there. And then a good friend, Dennis Reichel, saw me, and me and Dennis kind of hooked up, and we got on the same plane. The Marines did it differently, as I mentioned before. They sent us to Okinawa from Da Nang to pick up our winter gear. As I mentioned before, they told some of us that you might not be back, but we'll send it home if you don't make it. But anyway, we picked up our winter gear. We had sent a box of stuff home, like all of us did, and it was all free shipping. But I wasn't ready to come home. After Okinawa, spending 3, 4 days there, we were sent to El Toro, which is in Southern California around Irvine in the southern part. And that was a Marine Corps Air Base at the time. Now they're at Miramar. But anyway, that's beside the point. I wasn't ready to come home. There was no way. And I knew I was going to get out early. And I had two decisions to make. I After I did my travel, and I'll talk about that next, I was a seasoned traveler, or so I thought. I had two choices. I thought maybe I'd just go south through Mexico, end up in Rio. I had a passport and about $1,500 cash with me, and I'd end up in Rio and then come back through Miami and stop along the way. That would have been a fun trip. But I thought, nah, maybe I better try and find myself and get my feet back on the ground. So I did get discharged on May 8th. And that was a very interesting day because that's the same day my best friend Kiwi got killed in Nam. My friend Denny Reichel thought he was going to get out as well, but he missed it by a week or two. And he was a hard-headed German kid. He lived South Milwaukee, and he had a scholarship to Annapolis. He didn't want to put up with it, so he went in the Marines. I don't know why, but he was a controller up north near Fubai. And we were good friends because we knew each other from the East Coast. He was pretty angry, but he went back to a base for a couple months, got out, and was fairly successful. But he's gone too now, probably from Agent Orange. So I set out from El Toro, Southern California, and I had hitchhiked before, both in the US and in Australia, and I thought, yeah, what the hell. So I stuck my thumb out and I rode up. Of course, I spent a day or two at Disneyland because I always want to do that. And I stayed downtown LA for a while. uh, right as cheap as I could find it, just hanging around. And I would take a bus up to Hollywood at night, drink a little bit, hang out, and then I'd take a bus back downtown to my cheap flop downtown LA. But I was riding with the night shift and some of the ladies of the night. I wasn't into that then, but they were on the bus as well. So from there, I hitchhiked north and I went to San Francisco and I spent 2 or 3 days in San Francisco. I had to see Haight-Ashbury, what it was like, and it was quite different. The people seemed friendly. I wasn't in uniform, so they didn't really think they had to spit on me or anything, but other people experienced that. From there, I just hitchhiked north up into Northern California. I stopped in Portland, and somewhere between Portland and Seattle, this older fella picked me up. He was in an old car, old beat up car, and the whole back seat was full right up to the top with all kinds of stuff and memorabilia. I figured he was in some service. He was a World War II veteran, and we talked for about 2 or 3 hours. He said, "You were one of us, weren't you?" I said, "Yeah." And he said, "I could tell by the way you were acting." And then he told me about what he did during World War II in the Pacific and all that stuff. He was pretty open about it. So then I went up the road and I stayed in Seattle for a couple days. That's when Seattle was a nice place to go through. Portland also. From there, I hitchhiked to Vancouver, BC. Vancouver was a beautiful city. I didn't make it out to Victoria Island, but I just loved that place. There was a nice park, and I hung around there for 3, 4 days. But that spring was cold, and I decided there was no way I was going to hitchhike across the mountains and be stuck on some road waiting for a ride. So I hooked on a bus and I took the bus across Canada, stopped in Edmonton, Calgary, Winnipeg, and some of those other frontier towns. But I basically drank my way across Canada because I was used to doing that. What I would do is get some cold cuts and some bread and make myself a sandwich, eat it on the bus, and then I'd hit to the bar when the rest of them were having their lunch. And I was quite used to bus travel. Winnipeg was a little different with the bar. They had it similar to what I experienced in Australia. There was a place for the men and a place for the women and a place in between where you could mingle. But if the women came into the men's part, that was frowned upon.
Wow.
And that's the way it was. And this was 1969.
Right.
Definitely was that way in Australia when I was there. So I come to Winnipeg and then I went through northern Minnesota. I'd never been north of the state fair in St. Paul ever in my life. So I'm winding my way down. I didn't really stay any place in Minnesota. We went up past Duluth, a beam Duluth, you would say. And I said, well, hell, I'll just stay in Minneapolis for 3, 4 days. So I was staying another cheap flop where some of the people that needed some assistance were there. Some of the people that had a problem with alcohol and drugs were also staying there because, like I said before, it was a cheap flop. But hell, I was fearless after what I had been through. And I'd be uptown at night, hanging out at some of the bars. I didn't know what kind of clientele they were there, and I had a good time. So then I hopped on a bus and I said, you know what? I think maybe it's time I went home. Because I never told my folks when I was coming home. Because number one, I didn't know if I was coming home. And number two, I didn't know when. I didn't know what I was going to do. And like I mentioned before, if my friend from New Zealand hadn't gotten killed, I might not have ever come home. That's just the way it was. So I get to Belle Plaine on a bus, which was 9 miles north of the farm. And I called from the bus depot. I called my number, and my mom picked up the phone. I think she dropped the phone. And my dad said, well, it's about time. I said, yeah, you can come pick me up. I didn't want to embarrass them at the airport or anything like that at all. I even considered hitchhiking to the door, but that might have been too much of a shock. and I thought better of it. I mean, after a while, I found out that my mother, it really hurt my mother a lot when I was gone. Even though I didn't get along, she took it pretty hard, especially when I stayed and nobody knew when I was coming home. So that's about it. I got home and I adjusted, like I said before, and not too well though. I was drinking every weekend and working building silos, and then I worked at the sugar factory, and I displaced a couple of my sisters. I don't think they ever forgave me for that, because for about 6 months I went into my old bedroom. You can imagine this crusty old Marine coming home and staying in his bedroom and coming home in varying states of inebriation. It probably wasn't a good time for my parents or my sisters, and I still think there's a little rub there, but such is life. We must go on and do our thing. I did adjust after a while. I ended up getting a job with the FAA that next year and became an air traffic controller. So Dirty Dan, the radar man, did his thing and had a good life and had a good family and a good wife. And she kind of put up with some of my antics and silliness, because they're still present today. You can ask my son.
Can we talk a little bit about what the mood of the country was like before and after you left? And I know, we're not gonna go on some big anti-drug tangent, but I know drugs were never your thing and they still aren't. Can you talk a little bit about what you saw in terms of the counterculture thing? And I know you've talked to me a lot about like how much of a problem drug use was in Vietnam. And again, you didn't go down that path, thankfully, but can we touch on that a little bit?
Yeah, I noticed it was a little more prevalent because I was in a civilian uniform. Some of them didn't mention any of that, but there was a lot of drugs. Portland, there was some kind of a underground thing where they could escape to Canada and avoid the draft. I talked to them about that. I didn't say one way or the other, because in some crowd you didn't want to express yourself too freely lest you get in trouble. But it was a different feeling when I left. And when I enlisted in 65, things were different. And most of us didn't really know how bad it was. We had no idea. We didn't listen to the news. We were in high school having fun, goofing around and all that stuff. We knew that the drugs were there, but in high school, they weren't prevalent, and there weren't people that were taking them or anything that we knew of. So people were anti, and I noticed it in the music. I love music, so do my children, but you could tell the tone. From when I enlisted, it was nice and kind and quiet and lovey and all that stuff. But towards 1970, it got more intense, more violent, more of a bad tone to it. And I noticed that in particular. Some of them went over the edge, protesting and busting up stuff. And some of the early stuff, some of the National Guard weren't properly trained back then. And there ended up some bad incidents, probably because of they hadn't been in those situations ever before. They didn't know how bad it was going to get. So that was there. But there definitely was an attitude, and especially when I went on campus to college briefly on the GI Bill, it showed up. There were groups there that they just didn't like what was going on, and some just protested because they wanted to protest. That's kind of how that was. And no, I never got involved. In fact, I was in Nam so long, people thought I worked for Central Intelligence, that I was a narc, because I never took drugs. There were some nights that there was so much pot smoke in the area, the sand fleas were doing 360s in the air. And there was a cloud, an inverted cloud sometimes of the smoke. So I learned what it smelled like. I learned what it did. And even then, it was a gateway for some. And I think now what's happened, it's become so casual and some of it is pretty hard. It's pretty wicked, some of that marijuana, and it can put you down if you don't watch it.
So if you could go back and do this all over again, you're not a person that has many regrets, if any, in life, I know, but is that what you needed to do to kind of get your head straight? And what do you think would have happened had you not done that, if you just called right away and went back home?
I don't think I would have adjusted well. I probably would have got into some disagreements and probably just took off. And that's what it was. So I think that it was good that I did that. I had time to talk to a lot of people from different walks of life and kind of calm myself down. The alcohol consumption didn't really quit later on, and I mentioned this one time. I spoke to a group right here in Arlington about it, and I thought because I was only drinking once a week that I didn't have a problem, but I did because I was a binge drinker, and I drink myself over the edge and say, "Ah, what the heck? I got a good job, kids are taken care of, I got a day off in the middle of the week, why not?" And nobody's suffering because of it. But later on, it took me till I almost got to 55 before I realized I can't be doing that. So I pretty much cut it out.
Anything else, you want to share here on this topic? We've certainly covered a lot of territory already, but
Well, no, and I had mixed feelings even when I got back. I didn't know if I should have spent more time or if I should have went to another city first. I had relatives in Alaska. The pipeline was starting, and one of my aunts, my dad's sister, was a good friend. She said, "You should have called us. You could have come right up to Alaska and got a job." Well, I didn't know that at the time. I wasn't paying attention. I didn't have a big urge to get home. I'll put it that way.
Mhm.
I didn't. I just thought, well, okay, it's probably time. And like I said, I was only to find out later how much my mom suffered at her wake. And a doctor told me that right to my face. He said, "You have no idea what your mother went through." And I guess I didn't at the time. And I have spoken about the Blue Star parents at length and have mentioned that in the past. So,
Okay. All right. Well, thanks for doing this here. We got another one coming up here in a minute, so we'll take a little break and talk about your time in Australia.
okay.